What's up, everyone? Doesn't it seem a little like magic how tattoos stay in the skin? Well, today we're going to talk about how tattoos work. Let's get started. Way back in ancient times, when tattoo first originated, it involved cutting into the skin and then rubbing the ink mixture onto the open wound. And also using needles made of wood or bone to push the ink into the skin tissue. Thankfully, tattooing has majorly evolved since then. Now, modern tattooing uses precise instruments and needles to mechanically drive the ink into the skin. This involves using needles that are soldered together, driving in and out of the skin roughly 80 to 150 times a second. With each stab of the needle, ink is injected into the skin. Now, at this point, your body is considering the ink that's being injected as foreign material. And with that, your body is going to try and fight that. Your body's immune system responds to this by deploying white blood cells called macrophages to deal with the foreign object. Some of the ink does get lost this way, but not a whole lot. Now, dead macrophages and ink that didn't get consumed are now fixed in the skin, known as fibroblasts, and now that remains visible in the layers of the skin. Now, I know that's all super scientific and maybe just a little bit boring, but I find it pretty interesting, and sometimes when you understand how something works, somehow it makes it a little bit less painful. But let's try and break it down just a little bit more. So, if you paid attention in school, then you probably remember that the skin is the largest organ of the body. It covers and protects your bones, as well as your organs and other important parts of your body. Now, if you still remember from school, the skin is broken up into two layers, and that is the epidermis and the dermis. Now, the epidermis is a part of the skin that you can see. It's the very top part, and it renews itself mostly by flaking off. So what you see as dead skin cells is the epidermis shedding itself, renewing and revitalizing. Now, in tattooing, if the ink doesn't go deep enough and it stays in the epidermis, then you could very well end up with an unrecognizable image. And then as your epidermis undergoes its normal process of flaking off and shedding itself, ink could be carried away. And then you're left with nothing more than just a blob of ink in your skin. Now, the dermis is the second layer of skin. Now, this is where your sweat glands, hair follicles, blood vessels are stored. All this plus some lymph nodes and sensory cells form the cutis. And then right under the cutis is the subcutaneous layer, which is where the fatty tissue is that protects you from the cold in the winter. And when the ink goes too far into the dermis, into that subcutaneous layer, that's when it can cause blurred lines, also known as blowouts. And we're going to cover that more in another video. But for now, you at least know what a blowout is and what causes it. Now, when the needle penetrates into that dermis, there are also receptor cells, and those send pain signals to the brain to let your body know it is being hurt. Now, it's not that bad when you get a paper cut, but it makes a huge difference when your body is being stabbed 80 to 150 times a second with a needle. And those receptors send out a flurry of panicked signals. That makes the experience of getting a tattoo rather unpleasant. And because the dermis doesn't flake off like the epidermis, the dye then remains embedded in your skin for life. So you can see in this picture, the needle is injecting the ink into the dermis. And you see, for reference, it has sweat glands and hair follicles and erector muscles. And then that yellow layer beyond the dermis is the fatty layer. And if your artist goes too far during the process and puts ink in that layer, that is where you will start to see blowouts. So we'll dive deeper into this next part more in another video, but I do want to touch on the ink real quick, just because it is obviously part of the tattoo process and going into your body. The ink is made up of two parts, a pigment and a carrier. Now, the pigment is the substance that gives the ink the color, and then the carrier is the solvent that ensures that the pigment is evenly mixed, and it protects against pathogens, and it also aids in application. So, as you saw in the picture before, and if you have a tattoo or have seen someone with a tattoo, getting the ink in the right place and in the right depth requires skill. The ink is not injected like some people believe. The needles on a tattoo machine don't work like the needles your doctor uses to give you a flu shot. Most needles have 3 or more points, and the ink is held between them. So when you see the artist dipping his needle into the ink, that ink is being sucked in between the needles and not into the needles because they're not hollow. And then as the needle pierces the skin, the ink is drawn down from between the needles into the skin. And the needles with fewer points are normally for line work, and then the needles with more points are usually for shading and packing in color. Again, we can go over that more in another video if that's something you guys like, so be sure to let me know down in the comments below if that's something you want to know more about. And that is essentially how a tattoo works. I know it can get a little scientific, but I do find that part of it is interesting and kind of just little fun facts to know. I hope this helped you understand tattoos better. Make sure you subscribe and enable notifications, because in the next video we're going to talk about tattoo pain. Thanks for joining, and we will see you guys in the next video.